Going through the book of James for the last many weeks. The premise being the question that I asked you guys, I've asked you every week actually. So what? Okay. Remember, James is writing to Christians. He's not writing necessarily to the people on the fringes. And he's not writing to non-believers, although that's applicable to them as well. What he's really doing is he's writing to the church, this dispersion, these people, foreigners, living in a foreign culture, away from their homeland. And they're believers. They believe. They have faith. They believe in Jesus Christ. And he says, as he did last week, so you believe, good. Even the demons do, so what? Has it changed you? Has it made you a different person? In relation to the poor, in relation to the widows, the orphans. And here today we'll see in relation to how we talk to each other. Oh, this is a juicy passage. I'm actually going to spend this week and next week talking about it because there's so much to unpack in just this one chapter, chapter 3. We just did the first verses today. Next week we'll unpack it even further because the subject for James, he devotes an entire chapter to the way in which you and I talk to each other in the church. Words, speech, and how monumentally valuable they are, and how we put such a minor value on the words that come out of our mouths. And James says, no. You got to realize that this thing causes a lot of problems unless you find the way to bridle it. The whole book of James, what it really is, it's a practical letter. He's extremely practical, and today he's going to be practical with how we talk to one another. He's trying to get from what I'm calling a mere profession of faith to a real possession of faith. Not just a profession of faith. He says, good, you say you believe in Jesus. You go to church, you read your Bibles, you sing all the songs. Good. So what? Has it melted you? Are you different now than you were before? And you know it, he says, by the way in which you go out and react to other people. And he actually, if you look at chapter 1, if you remember at the end of chapter 1, he gives you sort of a mini outline. At the end of chapter 1, in verse 26 and 27, he says, if anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit widows and orphans in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. See, what he's doing, you can look at it if you want to outline the book of James, if you're an outline kind of person. Chapter 1 and chapter 2, he's primarily dealing with the way in which Christians ought to show their faith in the care and the service of others who are needy, poor, broken, widows, orphans. And then in chapter 3, he wants to press on to us how Christians should implement their faith in the way in which they use words, the way in which we talk to one another, the way in which we teach one another. And he gives a strong caution. And then we'll see in the next coming weeks, the next part of the book of James, essentially chapter 4 and chapter 5, are about how we live in the world. How are Christians supposed to interact with the world around them? And mind you that these are Christians, I said, who are foreigners living overseas. And they're just trying to get by. You could imagine them because I know most of you are like them. And so we'll see that in the coming weeks. But today, he talks about speech. And he says, in verse 1, he starts off right with the utter importance, the power of words. And I'm going to focus on that today, and I'm going to sort of beat a dead horse for you. You'll hear me repeat the power of words because I think that's what we all need to realize. I do, at least. And I think you do as well. And then after verse 6, we'll see next week, he starts talking about the purpose of words, the practice, I will call that. But today what he wants, I think, us to see is the utter power of words that we might otherwise minimalize. He says speech is crucial. He goes so far to say in verse 2 that if you were able to control your tongue and the words that came out of your mouth to other people, you'd be perfect. Let that sink in a second. He doesn't say if you're able to control your mind powers. He doesn't say if you're able to control your mind, then you'd be perfect. He doesn't say if you're able to control it. He says he makes a bold declaration. to say that if you and I learned the secret to controlling our tongues, our words, the way we teach and admonish others, he says, then you'd be perfect. But he says the tongue is set on fire. It's a constant source of unruly problems. We're always talking ourselves into problems, are we not? We're always, and this is why I use the King James Version, because he says, if nobody offends, the King James Version uses the words offend, whereas in more contemporary translations, they soften that word. Stumble, it comes across. If anyone stumbles, you think of stumbling, oh, I hit a rock, oh, I stumbled. No, the King James Version says, no, offend. He says, I know that when you talk to people, you are bound to offend them. When you teach people, when you profess your Christian faith, you're bound, James argues, to offend in many ways. And I thought, this is one of those, it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I hate when people do that. It goes without saying, but they say it anyway. This goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I'm the pastor. And I know I get up here and I give sermons, and I've heard from people, actually quite often people come up to me after service and say, Pastor, I don't think you live up to that. And I say, you're right, I don't. That's why I'm preaching on it. Because all the week that I'm preparing this sermon, I have to preach it to my heart first before I can preach it to you guys. So I stand from here in a place that I want to learn what he says about using words. Because I guarantee you, if you spend 15 minutes with me, I'm bound to offend you. I'm bound to. I consider myself a somewhat nice guy, but I offend a lot of people, and I know that. So I'm with you on this journey this morning to look at what words mean, the power that they have to tear someone down or to lift them to the heights. Focus on that first. And then what does the gospel give us in terms of freedom on the way we use words? It's quite powerful stuff. So I'm going to walk along this with you this morning. Because we start off with, if you follow in your outline, the power of words. And in verse 1, James is talking to people like me. He says, teachers will have greater condemnation. And the King James Version, again, why I read that, is because he translates that as masters. And that's actually a better translation, because what James is driving home is this word. It's a Greek word that's used pretty often in the New Testament. It's a funny word, though, because it's applied to many different people in many different ways. It translates to teacher or master, but it's applied to people like Jesus. It's applied to people like John the Baptist. It's applied, even Paul in his letters applies this word to false teachers. So what he's saying is, this passage is, yes, verse 1 is for me, the pastors of the world. But I'm going to stretch it today to say that it's actually for all those who would profess their faith to another. He's giving a word of caution to anyone who's in a teaching position. To anyone who says, I'm a Christian, let me tell you about what Christianity is. It's heavy stuff. See, you don't get off the hook this morning. It's primarily about me, I got it. I take that rap. But you're not off the hook this morning, because if you've ever tried to explain your Christian faith to somebody, you're trying to teach them. If you're trying to teach them, this is advice for you. The tongue. Be aware of it. Now, I got to do something first. A little semantics. You're going to probably come up to me after church and say, I think you're just splitting hairs there, Pastor. I don't know, I'm not buying that argument. Let me say something here. In verse 1, he says, the teachers will have greater condemnation. Now, if you're new to the Bible, or if you're new to the Christian faith, you'll read that and say, wait a second, he's saying that I go to hell because of what I say? That I'm condemned because of the words that come out of my mouth. You say, wait a second, he's saying that I'm judged, I'm sentenced, I'm condemned because of the words that come out of my mouth. Not really, and hold on. Commentators point out that he uses the word greater condemnation. He uses a qualification statement, which is to say that this is not the condemnation of sending you to hell. This is not the final judgment. But this is a sort of what I'll call an evaluation. Let me explain further, and I'll give you an illustration. If you go back to Romans 8:1, which is one of the bedrock verses that I love. Go back to Romans 8, chapter 8, verse 1, and you'll read, Paul says there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. There you go. You believe in Jesus, you're saved. No judgment. But then Paul, in the book of 1 Corinthians, comes right back and says this, chapter 3, verse 12. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each has done. See, what he's saying is this. How do you reconcile those two? You say, wait, on one hand he says, if I believe in Jesus, there's no condemnation for me. But now James is saying, if I misspeak and offend people, if I upset them with my words, and there's greater condemnation. What he's saying, I'm going to use two different words. And this is where I'm going to get into semantics and split hairs a little bit. What he's saying is not judgment, but rather evaluation. What James is essentially saying is your words, the words of pastors and teachers and people who profess their faith to others, Christians, the words that come out of our mouths will be evaluated. We're not judged by them in the sense that we are not judged at all. We're not condemned if we believe in Jesus. He took the penalty for us. We're saved. Check the box. But Paul and James both say, well, back it up a little bit. You may not be judged by what you say, but you will be evaluated, and there is a big difference. Let me explain I'll give you the illustration of what I mean by this. What does he mean, judged versus evaluated? If you were to go down to the busy intersection here outside the church, and you stand on the corner and you're thinking about crossing that street, what do? You look to see if the light is turned red or green. And even if it's green, you probably give a second look because it's Seoul and there's crazy drivers here. You give a look right and left to see if there's cars coming. You may think, do I have enough time to make it across this big street? Because that's quite a big intersection. What are you doing? You're evaluating the situation. And we all do this in life. You have to do it. You can't get out of bed without evaluating. What clothes am I going to wear today? Does this make me look fat? That's an evaluation. But here, back to the traffic. What's the difference between evaluation and judgment? Evaluation is to look at that traffic and say, can I make it across safely, or will I perish? Shall I try to cross? And if the light is red, you have evaluated, you should not cross at that time. It's not safe. Judgment, on the other hand, would be, and this is rather silly, if you look at the red light and you say, oh, how I hate traffic, and I spurn this red light, I shall leave now and never cross a street again. Streets are dead to me. Get rid of them. See the difference? I don't think you're never going to cross the street again. But see, the second is judgment. The second is cut it off. In, out, black, white. Saved, not saved. What James is pressing, though, is to say that teachers, masters, Christians will be evaluated by their words. And he says you have to be cautious about that. You have to be cautious because, as Christians, when we try to talk about our Christian faith, much has been given to us, and it's up to us to treat it with sensitivity and reverence, James would argue. He says you have to know how powerful your words are, and how when you talk to somebody, as C.S. Lewis would say, to paraphrase him, you're either pushing them closer to heaven or closer to hell. Don't you see that? Your words matter. And as a Christian, anytime that you and I stand up and profess our faith, whoa boy, be careful. I want you to profess your faith, please do. I don't want to scare you out of it this morning. Please tell people that you're a Christian. Tell them why you're a Christian. Tell them how you became a Christian. Tell them all about the grace of God. But the minute that you do so, the minute that you try to teach them anything, the minute that you try to teach children, the minute that I stand up here, I have to be very guarded and careful with my words because words carry weight, and this is a responsibility. And James would argue, I think, that you have that same responsibility if you profess to be a Christian. And Jesus confirms this. If you don't believe James Jesus in Luke 12, chapter 12, verse 48 says, to whom much is given, much is expected. See, you're evaluated. We are evaluated on our words because our words are so powerful and they bear weight and they can cut someone to the core or they can raise them up to the heavens. And when we talk about God to others, we need to know the masterful responsibility that we carry. We've been given much, so much is expected. Tread lightly. Be humble. You've been given a lot, Jesus says. So a lot's expected of you. I got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old that I talk about quite often up here. And they're in the stage where they could be loving buddy friends for life at one moment, and then the next moment, mortal enemies, scratching and clawing over the same silly toy, although we have hundreds of toys in our home. And of course, when they're ever doing that, and I'm in my office and I'm working and I hear the screams elevate, and there's like as a parent, you get used to screams, right? There's one scream that you know, okay, they're not dead yet, they're still screaming. There's another scream that's saying, okay, it's getting serious. And there's another scream level that says, I gotta go get in there and intervene. They go from like 1 to 3 very quickly at times, fighting over toys. So of course I go in and I have to separate them. And I look at my 5-year-old and I say, what do you say? You've heard this as a child, if you're an older sibling. You should know better. Now, it's not really fair that I do that, is it? I should punish my 3-year-old as well, and we often do. But see, my 5-year-old has more cognitive abilities to understand that there are many more toys in the house that she can play with. To whom much is given, much is expected. And I'll look at her and say, and she says, that's not fair. He started it. It's not fair. It's my toy. And I say, no, it's not fair. But you're the older one. More is expected of you. You should know better. See, this is why James puts the emphasis on teachers and masters, because what he's saying is, you should know better. And this morning, I'll extend that to all Christians, actually. I'll extend it a little bit more than James does. Because all Christians should know better. And therefore, if we know that it's a sensitive topic, that we know that we have a great responsibility in sharing our faith with other people, in teaching other people about the Bible, about Jesus, about grace. Every time we talk about it, we're blown away by the power of our words. We know, as James says, that it can set a fire. Then, what you start to get is humility. You start to come and talk with other people and know that you don't know everything. And know that even if you're absolutely sure about this one thing, you might be wrong, so let's be careful with our words. You come with graciousness in your words. You come with forgiveness in your words. You come with humility in your words because you've realized there's greater condemnation. There's a greater evaluation for those who should know better, James would argue. The power of the words that come out of our mouth. James gives the illustrations. I don't even need to unpack them. Go back and look. Verse 5, verse 3 through 4, verse 6. First of all, this is an interesting note. You should know this. This is one of the only times in the Bible that a body part is said to have life unto itself. He says that the tongue boasts. He doesn't say your hand boasts. He doesn't say your foot boasts. He says the tongue boasts. He gives, the image here is that he's giving life to the tongue. You see how powerful this is? He's saying your tongue has life, a life almost unto its own. And you know sometimes when you're talking with somebody, you get a little carried away. You know what that feeling is like. Your tongue has come to life. You're bound to offend them. But then he goes further and he says, look how small this thing is. It's one of the smallest muscles in your body. And yet he says it controls the whole thing. Like a rudder, small little rudder controls the ship, a big ship. A small little bridle put into a large horse controls it and tells it where to go. You see, he's pressing home and needling this through, and that's what I'm trying to do for you today. To realize that every encounter you have with someone is precious and weighty. And he says that none of us have tamed the tongue. He says it's an impossible feat. You can't do it. It'll always be setting fires wherever you go. You are always going to be offending people. Wherever you go, James argues. You can't control it, he says. He's very clear. It cannot be tamed. And he says, even if you were able to contain it, you'd be a perfect person. And we know that's not the case. Words are serious. You know, they teach this to kids on the playground. You know, what's the little rhyme? Sticks and stones. You know this one. Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Oh, dearie. We've been giving our kids a fallacy their whole young life, and kids, more than anybody, know that to be not true. Sticks and stones, they'll break your bones, but words can kill you. Why do you think it is that when somebody disrespects you, it hits you so hard and cuts to your heart? Why do you think a bad word from somebody can set you down a trail your entire week where you're angry and sullen and grudging? But a good word from your boss, from your teacher, from your friend, from your spouse, a good word will take you up to the heights. Why is that? Sticks and stones will break your bones, but words, James says, words will set you on fire. Don't kid yourself. You can't master it, even if you tried. Now, does that make you feel a little depressed? Here, I'll even carry it further. There was a married couple, famously, an older married couple back in the day. He used to be a pastor. I think he stopped being a pastor so far. They did this class. They held a class, a series of classes on a topic called sonship. It's a fancy term that we use in the church, sonship. Doesn't it sound nice? Sonship. What does it mean? Well, it's got different definitions depending on who you ask. But their meaning of it was this. If you and I as Christians truly lived as if we were sons and daughters, adopted sons and daughters of the Lord Most High, the way we treat other people and the way we talk to other people would be radically different. Their argument is that we don't actually live in light of the grace by which we're saved. Because if we lived by grace, if we lived as sons and daughters of the Most High, inheritors, heirs, free gifts given to us, if we lived, they would argue, every day like that, we would be radically different. And to prove it, they did this. They gave what they called a tongue test. No, it's not like what you think. Peter Piper picked it up. No, not that. Another type of tongue test. I think they maybe called it a tongue assignment. Tongue test is easy to remember. And they said this, here's what you have to do. Here's your assignment. And you can do this for a week if you want. Take copious notes for the week. Come back on Sunday and we'll compare notes. They said, do these things for the whole week. They said, don't complain about anything. Don't boast about anything. Don't gossip or help spread other gossip. Don't criticize someone. Don't defend yourself. And do always affirm others. Here's the tongue test again. Don't complain. Don't boast. Don't gossip. Don't criticize someone. Don't defend yourself. Do always affirm others. If you are anything like me, you won't last an hour after we leave the service. And if you did last an hour, you couldn't boast about it. You'd fail the test. You see, what they were pointing at is this. We are constantly defending ourselves. We are constantly using words to cut others down. We are constantly using words to boast of ourselves. Defend. Affirm ourselves. Their point being was that you can't master the tongue by willpower alone. It will not happen. Try it. You'll make it an hour. I think most of us, if you're like me, will make it 5 minutes before we fail the tongue test. What then? I've taken you to the point of despair. You've said, okay, my words are weighty. I know that now. James says there's greater condemnation if I try to teach, if I try to explain my faith to other people, if I use my words. The tongue will set people on fire. Where do you go now? If I sent you on your merry way, and if I said pray harder, and you'll speak better, it's not going to work. If I said read your Bible more, and you'll speak better, I'm not going to do it. If I said try harder and be nice, spread love, It's not going to do it. That's not the way we're wired. If you and I want to get a mastery of words, if we want to start to control our words, we need to look to the one who was the only one who passed the tongue test. There was only one who truly passed this tongue test. There was one that Isaiah 53, chapter 53 says, this one, this lamb, will be led to the slaughter, and he'll be silent. Jesus was the only one who successfully carried out the tongue test. He didn't boast, didn't complain, didn't criticize much. He was the Word, John says. He was the Word incarnate. And yet he held and measured his tongue. His words were weighty and he knew it. He didn't tear people down to build himself up. No, he was torn down so that you would be built up. See, knowing that you're saved by grace, looking to him, that's a great example. But it will only be that for you. It will never be the power until you know that when he was charged, he sat silent for you. When he was crucified, he cried out for you. When he was in the garden, he said, "Let thy will be done. Take me for them." See, you need to start looking at that. We do, I do. Every day, that's the gospel. And if you don't put it at the center of your life, if it's just something that you say, yeah, I believe in Jesus, he died for my sins and he saved me, good, check it, move on. No, there is no moving on. There's a constant and utter gaze back to this. What do you boast about? Think about what Jesus boasted about, the love of his Father. What do you complain about? Think about what he complained about. My God, why have you forsaken me? What do you criticize? Think of what Jesus criticized. He criticized death and self-righteousness, and he condemned sin. See, you and I, we use words to cut others down to build ourselves up. It was Jesus who used his words as he was being cut down so that you would be built up. Next week we'll see this further unpacked, because what James essentially says next week, he says, how dare you, how can you curse a man and then go to church and praise God? He says it can't be possible to do those things. We'll explain a little bit more next week, but here's what he's saying. He's saying the opposite of cursing other people is not honoring them. The opposite of cursing other people is worshiping God. It's a way to say that if your mouth was so filled with thanks and awe and reverence and wonder for the glory and the grace that you were shown, you don't have time to criticize others. You don't have time to condemn. You see, your words then are words of praise, not words of condemnation. Brothers and sisters, if you want to look at this, you have to see our words are powerful and they're weighty, and our tongue will always and forever get the best of us. We will offend and cite fire upon fire upon fire until and only when we pause and look back at the cross and say, oh my, that for me? I can hardly believe it. I have no more words. And you can sing that old hymn, his word shall not fail you, he promised. Believe him, and all will be well. Then go to a world that is dying, his perfect salvation to tell. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. And the things of earth will grow strangely dim, and the light of his glory and grace. If your eyes are on him, the world grows dim in the light of his glory and his grace. Go in prayer now. Give him your words silently. Reflect on this truth.